What went wrong with the Packers special teams last season, and how does it get fixed? How does Rich Bisaccia help it, and why his arrival is not enough to fix it? We talk with Kassidy Hill, who deep dove into the problem for Packers news, coming up next.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. You can follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers. And anytime you want to hit us up on the Locked On Packers fan hotline, you can do that, 920-341-3775 to stay Locked On Packers. And that's usually what we do at the outro. We did it for the intro. That's all right. We'll take it. We'll do it. It's Friday, guys. It's Friday and it's the off season. So we're all in off season mode here a little bit. Kassidy Hill, our friend from Packers News, is on the show today. She did an awesome deep dive into the Packers special teams debacle. She'd been working on it for months, and it has a lot of really good information in it, a lot of really good breakdowns in it. She also put a tweet thread out about with some of the clips of some of these plays, so you can look at them and remember them and go, oh my God, I forgot about that. Because I actually forgot. Just had shoved it deep down into the recesses of my brain somewhere. That the Packers missed 2 field goals against the Chiefs in a game that they lost by a touchdown. So interesting how that might have changed things in that game. Totally forgot, and certainly how it would have changed the way that we view that Jordan Love performance. But so this is a really fun conversation that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get to that, today's episode brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline is your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, news, and odds, including we've got the NBA Finals, we've got the Stanley Cup Final, we've got Major League Baseball in full effect, MMA, UFC, golf, soccer, anything you can think of to bet on, BetOnline has it. BetOnline. If you want to bet online, why wouldn't you go to a place named BetOnline? I mean, come on. It's right there in the title. Head to the website or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. We also have an important favor to ask. We put together a survey so we can learn more about listeners like you and make your favorite Locked On podcasts even better. This is your opportunity to tell us what you like and don't like about Locked On podcasts. Go to LockedOnPodcast.com/survey right now to get started. It won't take very long, and everyone that completes a survey can qualify for a chance to win one of 10 $100 Ticketmaster gift cards. To take our audience survey, go to LockedOnPodcast.com/survey. Joining me now, back again for a second time, our friend from Packers News, Kassidy Hill. Kassidy, it is really good to be with you. You wrote a really interesting piece, and wrote is almost not enough because there was so much reporting, so many conversations. You've got video breakdowns and clips. It is an incredibly comprehensive piece. When we talk about these things, they're called, little inside baseball, postmortems. And in this case, that seems like a very fitting title for the special teams for the Green Bay Packers for the last few years, because the Packers desperately needed to come back to life, right? So when you were working on this, what was the thing that you were most hoping to learn?
Well, to be honest, Peter, when it was brought to my plate and said, would you like to work on this? I just kind of figured it would be a one season look, what went wrong this season. And obviously you focus on the 49ers playoff game and everything that just clearly went wrong there. I really thought I would break down what went wrong in 2021 with not only the 49ers game, but that Chicago December game where Grant just went off, the Kansas City game where there were a couple of botched field goals that were more due to operation than Mason Crosby, and the Cincinnati Bengals game that, where no one could make a field goal to save their life, and then everybody was making a field goal. And so I really thought I would focus on that and kind of get into the tape of what went wrong. And then as I got further and further into it, I realized this is not just the tape. This is not a 1 year issue. And granted, I have not been covering the Packers for that long, but it was very clear that this was a fundamental club issue. Like, it was from the top to the bottom. This was a problem. It was a problem because of decisions that the front office has made over the past few years. It was a problem because of things on some level not being coached correctly, but also a problem of just special teams not being emphasized enough, so that even the things that were coached correctly were not handled correctly. They were not carried out on the field the correct way. And I think what really sort of shifted the focus of this entire piece was, and as you said, it was a postmortem, so much that went into it. And there's so much that didn't even get to make the final cut.
I'm sure.
I think before I really got started writing, I had over 25,000 words just in transcripts from different interviews. And the first version of this was 4,500 words. And my editor said, absolutely not. No way. And so I cut it down to 3,800 words, and he cut it down to 3,100. It was a really good collaboration between he and I to get it down to what it needed to be. But some of that extra stuff is what you were mentioning, was shared on Twitter the next day with some of the videos and the breakdowns. All of that to say, when this piece really started to take shape, was the day that Mo Drayton was fired. And a good friend of mine who wished to remain anonymous, so I'm going to honor that. A good friend of mine, though, that has been playing in the NFL as a special teams ace for about 10 years, does not play for the Packers, plays for a different team, but he called me out of the blue and he said, we need to talk about this. And I said, okay. And he said, let me tell you everything that actually has been the issue with the Packers special teams for the past few years. And he said, it's not even what you saw on the field this year. And he's the one who really sort of opened the door and made me realize how many issues there have been in the front office as well, just because of how they've handled things and the decisions they've made. And this is coming from someone who's been a part of those conversations, as a free agent at time, has been a part of those conversations, and has walked away going, that was a confusing decision that they made. And I thought one of the more interesting things he told me was that before the season started, he looked at the roster and looked at who the two long snappers the Packers had on the roster were, which was Stephen Wortell and Hunter Bradley, and said, that's going to be an issue this season. And he was right. And he gave specifics, the things that only a special teams person who is in it every day would really know. But it was just sort of an eye-opening revelation that this is more than just something maybe not being coached correctly, but it's in the roots. They just had to pull it up completely. And then as the interviews went on and different things sort of came to light, and Rich Bisaccia was hired, a longtime Packers fan, I was telling the story, or I was telling him, this is where this story is at so far, because I think it took about 5 months to put together. And he was saying, well, what's frustrating is how good they were in the 90s. And he started going back and forth. And that's what really kind of turned the light bulb on to talk to Desmond Howard, one of the last great, truly great special teams players for not only the Packers, but just in the NFL. I mean, he could go into the hall. I don't think he will, but he could go into the hall based purely what he did on special teams. He is the last Super Bowl MVP to win the award because of a special teams performance. And I think the only one, if I'm remembering correctly. And so getting to talk to Desmond Howard was really interesting just to hear. And, he didn't say anything super shocking, but it was just hearing the passion in his voice as to how important special teams was in the 90s, and that it was given the same amount of importance as the offense and defense were. And every team says that. They say they want to do that. That team actually did it. And you can look at the numbers. And he said, I was told every day, there are going to be times that Brett has an off day. You've got to pick him up. And that's something that was definitely missing from the special teams of the past few years. And so all of that sort of led to being able to ask Brian Gutekunst some pointed questions, and him admitting they've hampered themselves with the way they've drafted, And in a way, they've sort of been almost, even though they've hampered themselves in the draft, they've also been too beholden to it as well, and not willing to take on some more experienced free agents when needed to fill some of those four most important positions of the returner, punter, holder, kicker, long snapper. Yeah, I knew I was missing one.
So the free agency part of this, the front office piece, that was something that stood out to me because, frankly, that had not really been something that I had considered as a major part of the calculus here. I was just sort of like, I look around the league, everyone else seems to be doing the same thing where they're playing 6th and 7th rounders in these spots. They're career backups, with the exception of some guys we know, Matthew Slater and some of these other guys who have been special teams aces. Like, that's what they do. There's a pretty small number of guys who are that. At the same time, to your point, in the 90s, I can name like the specialists on those 90s Packers teams, Chris Jackie and Craig Hendricks. I can name the ace guy like Lamont Hollingquest. I remember those guys because they had profile. Mark Pryor, because they were an important part of those teams. I still think the 96 Packers are the most complete team in modern history, precisely because number one offense, number one defense, and they had the best special teams in the league that season. I want to ask you more about this personnel piece because the draft seemed to be driven, I wouldn't say in large part, but day 3 felt like, okay, like we're just going to let Rich Bisaccia pick all these players.
Right,
Like
exactly.
it was just like all the guys that they need. Did you leave your conversations and your sort of research since this started feeling like those questions had been adequately addressed in your mind in terms of process?
In many ways, yes. There's still some that we're just going to have to see it play out on the field to know if it was properly addressed. But I remember when I first started the first draft I wrote of this, I had a list of questions that I thought Matt LaFleur and Bryant Gutekunst needed to be asking. And then after the hiring of Rich Bisaccia, that took care of a huge one. And I want to get more into that in just a minute, but to finish answering your question. And then with the way they drafted and the way they have trusted Rich Bisaccia in signing some of these free agents so far. They trusted Rich Bisaccia when he said bring in a third kicker. And then of course they released JJ Molson, so now they only have 2. But they trusted Rich Bisaccia when he said bring in a third kicker. They trusted him when he said sign Nixon. They trusted him when he said release Bojo and sign Pat O'Donnell. And this is Bojo coming off one of statistically the best seasons for a Packers punter in franchise history. And yes, he had a down year towards the end, but statistically still one of the best punting performances in the franchise history. He said, I want Pat O'Donnell. And I'm trying to remember the exact timeline of that. Pat O'Donnell may have been signed before Rich Bisaccia was officially hired, but they were already talking to Rich Bisaccia. And so every part of me believes he was a part of that decision. And so they've trusted him, and they're already making moves that they normally wouldn't have made. And they brought in a second long snapper, Jack Coco, to compete against Wortell, which I know that they had 2 on the roster last year, but they brought him in early. And, Brian Gutekunst said that will be a battle all off season to see who can take that job. Goody has also said that Mason Crosby is the kicker until further notice. But again, they've trusted Bisaccia when he said we need to create a competition here. And so I think you see it there. And then you see it as well in the way they drafted. Yes, because, and that was one of the things I asked Brian Gutekunst after the draft was how much were Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs' ability to contribute on special teams, did that contribute to their grade? And he said, yes, it did. They may not be sticking them back there as just a returner every time, but they're going to use their speed and use their ability. And that was when he admitted we've hampered ourselves in years past by drafting guys purely for what they can do on offense and not evaluating for what they can do on special teams as well. And so, and Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Samari Torrey, who's going to be good, I think. He's somebody, I know he's a late round guy, but he's someone to keep an eye on. They've all been practicing on special teams. A lot of these guys I think today I looked out.
Christian Watson, an All-American returner at North Dakota State, it should be noted.
Exactly. You're right. And I think at one point I looked up today and I said to my colleague Pete Doherty, I was like, why is Sammy Watkins working by himself over here? And he said, because he's too old to play on special teams. And that's when I looked up and realized Sammy Watkins was the only wide receiver not practicing special teams. Everyone else was out there. Now, granted, Alan Lazard is not here right now. Randall Cobb has always made his money on special teams, but Randall Cobb, Watson, Dubs, Torrey, I'm trying to
And
think of
Lazard
who
played
else.
special teams last year.
Degara, right. Um, so did Equinemius St. Brown. He was one of their better special teams players. Um, every offensive playmaker except for Sammy Watkins was practicing on special teams, which says to me, and they start and end practice with special teams right now. And maybe that's something they did last mini camp, but at least during the season, that was not how practice was run. And so I'm seeing more importance given to it. I'm seeing it emphasized more and seeing them making moves that they had not necessarily made in the past because of listening to Rich Bisaccia. And and the fact that they hired Rich Bisaccia based almost not only on his resume, but off a player recommendation. And that really stood out as well, that Matt LaFleur was willing to listen to a former player who said, this is the best special teams coach I've ever been around. And that was kind of the confirmation he needed, and he trusted it. And so I think we're seeing a different mindset, at least, as to whether or not it'll play out on the field. That remains to be known, but they're at least changing how they think about it, which was the biggest hurdle.
The how they're thinking about it, I think, is a fascinating paradigm shift in an organization that for a long time under Mike McCarthy was just like, we'll just put a new coach in there.
Right.
They didn't have these sorts of come to Jesus moments where it's like, okay, now they didn't have the sorts of blowups. That's not even true. 2014 in the NFC Championship game, the playoff, that was
Russ,
a complete and utter disaster on special teams. Now, different circumstances, I understand that, but there was never this kind of thing. And I wonder how much of this, in whether it was your research or whether it was just your writing of it, you considered or asked about the impact of Matt LaFleur and all of this, because I was going through it and going, this is it. I think it takes a unique kind of coach to say, we're doing this all wrong. We need to change everything that we're doing it, and then doing it like that. That is like, that seems intuitive, but we've seen plenty of coaches not do that.
Right. Head coach is a unique personality because they're in charge and they like it that way and they want to stay that way. Hiring Rich Bisaccia, someone who's had head coaching experience and led his team to the playoffs with as a head coach, that sort of usurps some of your power, so to speak. And when we saw Rich Bisaccia on the field for the first time during rookie minicamp, I thought it was really interesting. Coaches move a certain way during practice, especially during stretch. Usually it's just the strength coach and the head coach that sort of move throughout the team. The position coaches will stick to their players. Rich Bisaccia was doing everything Matt LaFleur was doing. And it wasn't in a way to emulate him. It was just that's who he is and that's how he knows to coach these players. And so yes, to your point, it's a huge, I guess, nod. I'm trying to think of a better word. It's a huge nod to Matt LaFleur that he was willing to bring someone on who probably will have no problem telling him, you're doing it wrong. We're going to do it my way. And I think right after the season, we were talking to Matt LaFleur, and I asked him, because the Packers are very what's the word I'm looking for? Self-built. They keep everything in-house. We're going to draft our guys. We're going to keep our guys. We've got a lot of history. We do things our way. And asked Matt LaFleur after the season, can you look outside of the building? Can you look outside of football for answers? And he said, I think I have to. And, I'll start talking to other people that run businesses a certain way and see what works for them. And he was saying that in reference to special teams, which I think said to him, because I honestly think he was shocked, Peter. Like, he was just shell shocked. That's the biggest way he seemed to me. After the 49ers lost that night, he seemed obviously upset. But when we did a media availability with him the next day is when he just was like, eyes wide. I can't believe that happened. And I was talking to a player recently about special teams, and he said we all just went back to the locker room and nobody said anything. And then he said it took us days to clean out our locker because nobody was prepared. He said nobody had made any arrangements to go home. Nobody had bought plane tickets. Nobody had closed up their rental here in Green Bay for the winter. And he said, nope. He said, we just still couldn't believe it had actually happened. So all of that to say, I think Matt LaFleur was legitimately shaken to his core to realize that that could happen, and it was something that had been avoidable. It could have been so easily avoided with right coaching, right emphasis. And that's what stood out too. And I think I shared some of this on Twitter, was that all of the mistakes were so easily fixable. And it was, if this one guy does his job, that doesn't happen. If the wing holds out the inside and the outside gap, Jordan Willis or Jimmy Ward never gets through there. If the PP comes over and helps the long snapper, Jordan Willis never gets through there. It's if you just simply, on the Chicago play, if that outside man stayed with his angle, Grant never gets loose for that touchdown. Everything that should have been coached correctly, and probably was, because we don't want to put it all on Mo Drayton, but just wasn't ever emphasized as being important. And it's every single bit of the special teams issues this past year were avoidable. And I think that's probably what hit Matt LaFleur more than anything. And when you are humbled that way, there's not much many other ways you can be humbled. You have to just kind of accept it and move forward. Anything
as we finish up here, anything that didn't make the piece that you did not put on Twitter that you think is like a fun nugget, a fun something? This stood out to me. Like, give me something that was put on the cutting room floor that's still in your notebook somewhere.
Oh, that's a really good question.
25,000 words of transcripts. There's got to be
I
something.
know, right? Oh man, I'm trying to sift through, because there's some stuff I mentioned, but I didn't go into as much detail as I wanted. So, for example, one thing that I wish I had been able to go into a lot more detail, because I have a folder here that is about, yep, here it is. It is, how many pages worth of stuff here?
A lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I think that was all condensed down to about 3 sentences. And it's what Matt LaFleur asked about possibly playing more starters on special teams. And is it worth the risk? And he brought up losing A.J. Dillon in the 49ers game, which is understandable. How different would that have game been if A.J. Dillon had been in there for the rest of it? We don't know. But I think I mentioned the Bengals and the Rams in the story. But if you I dove into all 8 teams that were in the playoffs after the wild card round. And the Packers were statistically the worst of all of them. Shocker, they were worst of all 32. But how many of those teams use special teams? The Bengals use more starters per snap than any other team. And the Rams don't use as many starters, but they use big starters. They'll use Jalen Ramsey. They'll use Aaron Donald. They'll put these guys out there because they're their best athletes. And they want them on the field when it matters. And because of that, I think the Bengals were the least penalized team, which makes sense because it's full of starters. And let's see, there were some more. Oh, San Francisco, I think one of them was, they didn't have a great team, but they had a consistent holder, long snapper, kicker, guard. That makes all the difference in the world. The Packers didn't have that. And that's what caused the issues in Kansas City. And, oh man, I'm trying to think. I know there was more. Oh, I remember one other thing that didn't make the cut. Someone that's been doing this for a long time, again, wanted to remain anonymous. That was sort of interesting to work around, just because so many of these guys, the NFL, it's an incestual hiring practice, and they don't want to
Yeah.
speak out against the guy that could become their boss. And one guy that's been doing this for a long time told me any team that predicates themselves on offense never prioritizes special teams. He said, look at the
Interesting.
teams with the best special teams, they're defensive minded coaches. And Bill Belichick is one of the best examples of that. I spent a lot of time in college. Nick Saban's a great example of that. Um, I'll never. You remember last year when Bill
All those
Belichick,
Bears teams with Devin
the
Hester,
Bears,
and
yeah,
they were always defense first.
right. And I think Bill Belichick spent 9 minutes talking about a long snapper last year in a press conference, if I'm remembering
That
correctly,
seems right. Yeah,
about
that seems right.
10,000 words. And when he told me that, I started to look into it, and he's right. The best special teams units of the past decade have been on teams with defensive-minded coaches. If that had been something I had included, I would have dove more into that to figure out why that's the case. I'm not really sure why, but it clearly there's a trend. And, you look, I think he pointed out the Packers teams of the 90s as an example. That was a defensive minded team that just happened to have one of the best quarterbacks of all time on the other side. And then you look at the past two Packers coaches, and they've been offensive minded coaches, and special teams has taken a dive. I don't know what there is to that, but it's definitely a trend and something interesting to keep an eye on.
Well, you hope that they're moving in the right direction, as you said. This is the ultimate. The proof is going to be in the pudding, and we are not going to have pudding until September. So
Right now,
we're
they're
not
just
going to know. We're not going
mixing
to
up the
know
recipe.
yet. Yes, it is. It is in the fridge. It's setting somehow, or however pudding works. I haven't made pudding in a long time.
It just got weird.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a great place to stop. This has been so great. Thank you so much, Cassidy, and we will talk to you soon.
Of course, Peter. Thank you.
All right, thanks to Cassidy for joining the show. Awesome to talk with her. She is excellent. And we kept talking after about some more stuff that she remembered, more quotes and concepts. And so she's really great. Check her out on Twitter. You can follow her on Twitter at Kassidy G. Hill on Twitter. And of course, all her stuff is over at Packers News. Thanks for making Locked On Packers your first listen. Make your second listen Locked On NFL podcasts. Our national and local NFL experts and insiders keep fans dialed in with the biggest local stories and latest news from around the league, because an offseason doesn't mean a break in the action. Follow Locked On NFL every day on Odyssey, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. All right, we're back next week. We continue our 3 days a week format. We will have another Summer Friday. I'm hoping to have another rookie orientation series so that we can get you up to date on all these guys. We still haven't done Romeo Doubs. We still haven't done the offensive linemen. So still plenty of fun stuff to do this off season before training camp opens at the end of July. Plenty of time before then, which means a ton of content for us to get to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers. And anytime, should I say the number one Packers podcast on the internet, and the show for fans who know what happened. They want to know why and how. I flipped the intro and the outro, so we should do it this way. And anytime, my goodness, you want to hit us up on the Locked On Packers fan hotline, you can do that, 920-341-3775, to stay Locked On Packers.